For American President Barack Obama, managing the relationship with the world's other major economic power has always been a balancing act. How does the United States push for change in a country to whom it is indebted? That question faces Mr. Obama as he begins his second term. At the same time, China is undergoing its own once-in-a-decade leadership change. Early next year, Xi Jinping will take the reins of power. And, as so often with China, future policies are shrouded in mystery.
China's both an adversary, but also a potential partner in the international community if it's following the rules.
So which will it be, partner or adversary? The trade imbalance remains a key concern of the United States and of Europe. And what about China's rising military might, as the United States famously pivots to Asia? Tonight, I asked the man at the center of the U.S.-Chinese relationship, the American ambassador Gary Locke, and he joined me earlier from Beijing. Ambassador Gary Locke, thank you so much for joining me from Beijing.
Well, it's my pleasure, Christiane.
Ambassador, so much is happening in China, and of course, every time anybody looks in, they want to know, what about the rise of China? How will it hurt or harm me? And they want to know about human rights as well. So let's dive right into it. We want to know, from your perspective, whether the new leader, Xi Jinping, will be any different on Tibet, for instance, because there have been many burnings by ethnic Tibetans, another 4 reported just today in China. I know you've met with some ethnic Tibetans. What do you think is the prospect for any different kind of relationship, Ambassador?
Well, we're just going to have to wait and see, but obviously the United States is very concerned about the situation, the heightened tensions in the Tibetan areas, the deplorable self-immolations, and of course the policies of the Chinese government at all levels. And we're publicly and privately constantly urging the Chinese to re-examine some of their policies that threaten the linguistic identity, cultural identity, and religious identity of the Tibetan people.
And if I might, the new leader, Xi Jinping, his father was known to have worn a watch given to him by the Dalai Lama. So again, do you have any hope or anticipation that there might be some kind of different relationship between China and not only the ethnic Tibetans in China, but Tibet itself?
Well, I think that's certainly a hope, but whether or not those hopes will be realized remains to be seen. China is really ruled by a committee of 7, the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So it's going to have to be leadership by consensus, and of course Xi Jinping will be the first among that 7. So we're very, very hopeful. I think there are high expectations even by the Chinese people, but we'll just have to wait and see. But in the meantime, preserving the ethnic, religious, linguistic identity of the Tibetan people is a top priority for the U.S. government, just as we are very concerned about all human rights issues. And we believe that human rights has to be a fundamental part of the U.S. foreign policy, and we very much urge the Chinese government, publicly and privately, to adhere to the universal principles, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which are also a part of the Chinese Constitution.
Let me move on to more details about the new leader. He himself spoke about some of the shortcomings in China that need to be rectified, whether it's about the legitimacy of the party, whether it's the growing wealth inequality, whether it's corruption. Let me just play you some of what he said around his appointment.
The problems among our party members of corruption, bribe-taking, being out of touch with the people, undue emphasis on formality and bureaucracy must be addressed with great effort. The whole party must be vigilant against them.
So, Ambassador, he clearly knows what's on the minds of the people. I don't know whether the Chinese admit that the outgoing Prime Minister's family, according to the New York Times, amassed something like a $3 billion fortune. But corruption seems to be something that plagues China. Do you think that Xi Jinping will be serious about tackling it? And how difficult will that be, given the vested interests that are so cemented?
Well, these are tremendous internal challenges for the Chinese people and for the Chinese government, and it's very much an internal affair. But what's been remarkable is that the new leader, Xi Jinping, has spoken rather frequently on this topic of corruption and the need to reform, and has now designated the current vice premier, Wang Qishan, who's a highly respected individual that the United States government and business people are very familiar with and have had a very good working relationship with. Xi Jinping has tasked him to basically head up the anti-corruption efforts. So I think there's a lot of hope among the Chinese people. But again, we're going to have to see.
And Ambassador, he also is quite remarkable in that he has had a long-time connection with the United States. He's traveled regularly and frequently, much more than previous Chinese leaders, but particularly he spent time in the United States. And I've spoken to the governor of Iowa, for instance, who has, a fairly, close sort of business relationship with Xi and with China. Do you think that will affect, and how will that affect, China's relations with the United States?
Trade is such a big part of the U.S.-China relationship, and in fact, almost $1 billion of trade flows between our two countries every single day, and almost 1 million U.S. jobs right now depend on exports and trade with China. When you look at the entire Asia-Pacific region, it really accounts for 60% of the world's GDP, the world's economic output. And so fostering closer economic ties with China is in both countries' economic self-interest.
You sound hopeful for the future, are you?
Well, I really believe that as the two largest economies in the world, China and the United States have a great opportunity to solve the problems not just facing the United States and China, but actually to provide leadership to the entire world. Our scientists are collaborating on some of the drug-resistant types of TB. They're working on type 2 diabetes, breast cancer, a whole host of drug discoveries, as well as new energy. And I believe the world is looking for that leadership from both China and the United States working together. But the United States and China are actually collaborating a lot on trying to, for instance, halt the proliferation of nuclear weapons from North Korea to Iran. So we do actually have a lot of partnerships together. At the same time, we do have disagreements. We have disagreements in trade. China has celebrated almost 10 years of membership in the WTO, but with that entry into the WTO come rules and obligations. And the United States has not at all been hesitant to ensure that China lives by the rules and to ensure that there's fair access, a level playing field for American firms, that China focuses on protecting intellectual property rights, and opening up its markets to American and foreign firms the way that America has opened up its markets to Chinese firms, all as agreed to when China entered the WTO.
Let me play you another bit of an interview that Xi Jinping gave when he was in Mexico a few years ago. This was directed at a foreign audience.
There are some bored foreigners with full bellies who have nothing better to do than point fingers at us. First, China does not export revolution. Second, it does not export famine and poverty. And third, it does not mess around with you. So what else is there to say?
He obviously was directing that at the United States. How did you take that when you first heard that? He's basically saying, don't interfere and don't lecture us.
Well, I think that we have a very intricate relationship and a very interdependent relationship economically, and certainly in terms of issues, global issues, whether it's trying to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. China has worked very closely with the United States at the UN on Security Council resolutions, and China has actually dramatically reduced its consumption of Iranian oil, along with other countries around the world, to comply with U.S. law. And so we have a good working relationship.
And finally, Ambassador, when you look at the Chinese people and you see the explosion, really, of, let's say, protests all over, the explosion of activity inside civil society, the explosion of the microblogs, how do you see the Chinese people's pressure on the government going forward and their demands?
Well, I think the Chinese government is reacting and trying to respond to the pent-up demands, issues, and concerns of the Chinese people. And the Chinese people are able to make their concerns known using the social media. the microblogs and what we call Weibo here. Many influential people here in China have millions of followers. And so the Chinese government officials are monitoring what the people are saying and what their views over the internet, which has had an impact on Chinese policy.
Gary Locke, U.S. Ambassador to China, thank you for joining me from Beijing today.
Thank you.